Anyhow, I am very, very proud to introduce our next speaker. I've come to know Jim Kofalt very well in the last 4 or 5 years. He's on our board of directors, was one of our founding members. He's the person that I email randomly and say, how do you do this in Windows? He always can answer it. So he's been invaluable to us with a lot of the technical stuff, a lot of the planning stuff. He's put a lot of heart and soul into the planning for this summit. And he is going to talk with us this afternoon about an issue that is very dear to, I think, every single one of us, and that is the Second Amendment, which has never been under such challenge in the state of New Hampshire as it has been this year. And I only thank that we have Governor Sununu there to use that red veto on these god-awful bills that have been passing. So, Jim.
Time for a brand new gun.
So I'm going to try to condense my speech a little bit to make up for lost time here. But we didn't think this event would be complete unless we talk a little bit about the Second Amendment. And it seems to me that every 2 years around election time, the majority of the candidates seem to transform into champions of the Second Amendment. Have you noticed that? Even a lot of the Democrats. I was at a candidates night back in October in my town of Wilton, and when the question came up about guns and gun violence, many of the Democrats sounded very similar. I believe in the Second Amendment. I love to hunt. I grew up learning to shoot a .22 rifle on my grandfather's farm in the summer. I love the Second Amendment. But, and that's where you always have to be careful, because whatever follows that is bad news. And what follows that is usually what they call reasonable restrictions. So I'm here to tell you that reasonable restrictions are not reasonable. Gun control is driven by irrational fear. It is fueled and stoked by fearmongers, most of whom are appallingly ignorant when it comes to firearms and gun owners. So it's up to us to fight back against that. But what is perhaps most irrational about gun control is that it rests on this premise that by giving more and more and more power to the government, that you are giving more and more and more power to the people, and good things always come from that. Just ask the people in Venezuela. Unfortunately, however, it is not only Democrats who are susceptible to this disease. Last year, when the 603 Alliance was vetting candidates for our Initiative 18 project, we sent out a questionnaire. And one of the questions on that was, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Local law enforcement should be able to determine who in their town should be able to carry a firearm. One of those came back with strongly agree circled and a notation in the margin that said, well, someone has to make that decision. So what is, I hope, obvious is that we chose not to work with that candidate. Right now we have another example of this that just passed the House, HB 696. And HB 696 is ostensibly about what they call protective orders, which is, more broadly speaking, referred to as red flag laws. And it is designed to ostensibly protect vulnerable people, but it allows a judge to issue an order for the confiscation of firearms. So all it takes is a vindictive spouse or ex, or an angry neighbor, or an upset coworker to make an accusation and convince one judge, that judge can, under this law, would be able to issue a confiscation order. The defendant gets no opportunity to argue in court before the police show up at the door and confiscate their firearms and ammunition. So this is a pretty extensive law, but firearms and ammunition appear 25 times throughout that law. To add insult to injury, the defendant, the person whose firearms are confiscated, is required to pay the police a storage fee. I'm not kidding. So they show up at the door, they confiscate your weapons without due process, and you have to pay them for it. Okay, now here's the punchline. There are 9 sponsors to this bill. 4 of those 9 sponsors are Republicans. Okay, I'm going to name them because they need to be named. They are State Senator Sharon Carson and Republican Representatives Ned Gordon, William Marsh, and Charles McMahon. Sharon Carson, Ned Gordon, William Marsh, and Charles McMahon. So, does that make us the party that opposes the protection of vulnerable people, like battered women? Not at all. There's another bill, HB 514, and many of the same people, primarily Democrats, who voted for HB 696 also voted for HB 514. HB 514 says that that vulnerable person cannot get a firearm for 7 days. It's a waiting period. So if someone is in fear of their life and feels the need to get a restraining order or a protective order to have somebody else's firearms confiscated, that vulnerable person has no means of protecting themselves for up to 7 days. Reasonable gun control is not reasonable. And to those who would say that the government acts rationally or reasonably or can be expected to do so, we need to start telling people stories. For example, a few years ago I heard from an attorney, firearms attorney here in New Hampshire, who was talking about a fish and game regulation that prohibits the carrying of loaded long guns in a motor vehicle. The intention of this regulation is to prevent hunting from a motor vehicle. And this attorney was testifying before the Fish and Game Committee, and he said, well, take as a scenario, for example, a hunter who's just getting his gear ready and about to head out into the woods to go hunting. And Fish and Game officer asks him, can you show me your license? He puts his shotgun down on the bed of the truck, reaches for his license, and the Fish and Game officer said, is that loaded? Yes, I'm going hunting. Congratulations, you've just earned a summons for carrying a loaded long gun in a motor vehicle. So all of this was explained at this Fish and Game hearing. The head of the Fish and Game department said, come on, we would never do that. To which the response was, you have already done that. Your Fish and Game officers are doing that to law-abiding citizens. So what do we do about this? We need to break through the noise. We need to break through the misconceptions. We need to break through the left's story that guns are somehow mysterious, unnecessary. You know, their excuses are usually one of 3 categories. One is, people are dying, we've got to do something, even if that something is completely ineffective or will actually endanger more people. Excuse number 2 is, You don't need that. And excuse number 3 is our society is just too militaristic. Tell that to the people in Hollywood who are making movies that glorify guns and violence. I am not suggesting, nor would I ever suggest, that we pass laws to constrain that. But I find it ironic that many of the people who are promoting that kind of culture are appalled when it produces in our culture some people who do bad things with guns. We need to talk to our friends. We need to be able to convey to them that gun owners are just like them. We're responsible people. I saw an article not long ago. Ian Underwood, a friend of mine, published an article in Granite Grok, and he talked about a conversation that he had with a friend. And in that conversation, his friend said, I don't understand why you are carrying a gun. Aren't you living in fear? And he said, do you have a fire extinguisher at home? Yes. Well, are you living in fear? Do you wear a seatbelt when you get in the car? Are you living in fear? I just recertified in CPR, and I'm not living with an irrational obsession that somebody is going to have a heart attack next to me. But if somebody does, I'd like to be in a position to help them. So these are the kinds of conversations that we need to be having. I would also encourage people to invite a friend to the range. Get people to the range, get them in front of a situation where they can learn how to handle firearms safely and responsible, and they'll realize that it's a tool, just like a lot of the tools that you might find at Home Depot. It can be dangerous, it needs to be treated with respect, but it's a tool. And finally, as I said before, we can never take it for granted that the candidates who say they are supporters of the Second Amendment are actually supporters of the Second Amendment. The aforementioned candidate who said they strongly agree that police should be able to limit who gets a firearm had an entire page on his website dedicated to his commitment to the Second Amendment. So the good news is we have some great groups here in New Hampshire. The New Hampshire Firearms Coalition researches these bills, puts out a lot of information. The Women's Defense League does a great job of getting people involved. In fact, talking about inviting people to the range, the Women's Defense League just had an event where they invited 40 or 50 college Republicans to come to the range and learn how to shoot. So we all need to be part of this solution to this problem. We all need to be voices for the Second Amendment. Thank you very much.
Croc TV.